Claire Lopez with the Intelligence Summit and also professor at the CI Center. Dr. Jasser, both you and Congressman Ellison spoke about the Constitution and our rights for free speech. And I wonder what you think is the best way to deal with the challenge to free speech, which is coming precisely now from the Organization of Islamic Conference, the OIC, which, as you and many here may know, recently got passed at the United Nations Human Rights Commission resolution that restricts free speech insofar as what you were just talking about, hate speech towards what is described by the OIC as Islamophobia, hate speech described as aimed at Muslims or the faith of Islam. What is the best way that we can make that resolution known, make it known what the attempt is? That is the attempt to stifle free speech.
Thank you. Yeah, I think those that formed the UN Declaration of Human Rights would be rolling over in their grave, Eleanor Roosevelt on, if they saw what was being purported to be part of now UN discussions about blasphemy laws, and the OIC is trying to put that forth, and the OIC has a lot of weight because of 57 states and especially oil issues, and we've been, I think, compromised quite a bit because of our concern of oil prices and how we deal with the ideology of Wahhabism and radical Islam. I think religious freedom is intimately, if not completely, wedded to the concept of freedom of speech, and you can't separate the two. Because it's interesting, recently there's been a lot of discussion about what happens to apostates in Islam. And you'll find that there are many, including Tariq Ramadan, for example, that has on his website that says, you know, the hadith, which is the Prophet's discussions, that says kill somebody if they leave, that's not a legitimate one. And he says that's not really what happened, which is, I agree with him on that, it's not legitimate. But then you see the further discussion says that, well, basically, you know, in Islam, people are free to leave as long as there's no threat to the unity or the Islamic State. And their words, and if you look at Imam Qardawi, he says that basically death is permitted. Jamal Badawi, the killing of apostates is permitted. Jamal Badawi, who is an Islamic scholar with ISNA, then goes on to say that, well, killing apostates is not what should happen, but if they say things that weakens the strength of the Islamic State and is a crime against the state, then they should be punished. So therefore you find that religious freedom is intimately tied to freedom of speech. And that's why you have to separate. There's no way to counter the laws that Islamists try to put through on blasphemy or against apostasy without separating mosque and state. Because as long as the strength of the state derives its power from the Quran and from religious law, at some point in America, for example, when I was in the Navy, you can't all of a sudden say, you know what, I'm going to leave now. You have a commitment in the military. So there is, at some point in America, if you swear allegiance to the U.S. Constitution and we have a war and you get drafted, at some point you have to have nothing that trumps your loyalty to your country. If religion is part of that mix, at some point, no matter how many apologetics you get that they won't kill or whatever, at some point the state will step in and interfere in religious practice. Unless you have a complete separation, that's not going to ever happen. And those laws, we need to build coalitions in America where especially Muslim organizations stand up and say that blasphemy laws are prohibited, that we will stand with heretics, we will stand with anybody that says whatever they want. And actually, I would do it from an Islamic perspective and say the example of the Prophet was to allow atheists to say what they wanted about Islam, that I could give you examples from the Islam I know there's other examples out there, but the examples I was taught about Islam was that disagreement was allowed, that conversions back and forth were allowed because this was the way people decided or didn't decide whether they wanted to get closer to God or not. But that freedom, and the last thing I would tell every Muslim is that if you truly, and other faiths, if you truly believe that my faith or whatever it is from God, it shouldn't need anybody to protect it. People should be allowed to say what they want. That's what freedom is, because God doesn't need anybody to protect him and from what people say. This is the problem. But you need coalitions. You need government to stand up for our values that are American, that are about Western freedom, and create coalitions of Muslim interfaith groups and government policy-making groups.
Thank you. Before we get to another question, Dr. Jasser, can you talk a little bit about, you had mentioned that some things were happening in schools and in mosques in America. There was a radicalization through, I think, literature and other things. Can you talk a little bit more about what specifically is happening in schools and mosques, and maybe some of your own experiences in that regard?
Yeah. You know, this is a difficult subject because I personally have not heard imams advocate violence or advocate, a jihad, etc. But the issue is what leads to that. And here in Northern Virginia, you saw there was an Islamic Saudi Academy that clearly had textual material that did advocate for and have passages in their text that talked about what to do to non-Muslims and killing infidels and things like that. And that was looked at by the Religious Freedom Commission and addressed. Now, what they did was they whited out the passages and they changed some things. But the bottom line, it's sort of like taking the Communist Manifesto and taking out some passages about Soviet aggression and saying that now the book is okay. That doesn't work. When a Wahhabi theocrat writes a book, it's going to be done through the lens of a theocrat. It's going to be about theocracy. So you have to start taking, and this is the problem I have as a parent. I want to teach my son and my daughter, my sons and my daughter, Islam. And yet, if I go to the websites, whether it's Sound Vision or ISNA's websites, I mean, if you go to Amana Publications, you have an endorsement from IIIT, which is the International Institute of Islamic Thought, for the Reliance of the Traveler. The Reliance of the Traveler is the Sharia text that talks about Shafi'i Islam approach to religious law. And this is from major organizations. And that basically endorses the killing of apostates, all these kind of things. And these are groups that George Mason University just gave a permission to have a $2 million endowment in their school. So these are mainstreamed organizations that are putting forth behind the scenes legalisms that are in the 13th century and have not been reformed. And any Muslims, please tell me where there's newer texts that are established mainstream Sunni thought. That's my own practice is Sunni, so I know the Hanbali and Shafi'i and Hanafi thoughts. But this all needs to be looked at. The schools basically are teaching, for example, in some of the schools in Phoenix that we saw, they teach the years after the Prophet Muhammad that were the 4 caliphs. And the interesting thing to me is, yes, those were periods in Islamic history that I think changed humanity in many ways. And you can talk about what's the right version or the wrong version. But the bottom line is, compared to our society today, it had many problems. It was not America. It had issues in the way it treated Christians and Jews as dhimmiyin or protected people. Now you'll find imams say that, well, protected means they have equal rights but different, etc. And the bottom line is that's 7th century thought. It might have been advanced at the time, but compared to secular America, where we separate church and state, and we talk about liberty and individual rights being equal for everybody, blind to faith, that was a far cry from that. And this is what's being taught in these schools, is that the rightly guided caliphs are sort of the ideal society. Please, if it's not being taught, I have, there is an imam in town, his name is Omar Shaheen, who is one of the flying imams, as you guys may have, many of you may have seen. He is one of the scholars at the Assembly of Muslim Jurists of America, AMJ Online. I would ask you to go to their website. This is over 200 imams. The organization is actually based out of Saudi Arabia and Egypt, but is about American Islamic law and is actually probably the leading organization of Sharia law in America. This organization had on its webpage a month ago a paper by one of its students about the Pledge of Allegiance. And it basically said that no Muslim should really follow the Pledge of Allegiance because you can't pledge allegiance to a flag. You can only pledge allegiance to a caliph or to God. And therefore, then we called attention to it and wrote a little piece about it and sent it out. And next thing I know, it was taken off the website. By the way, I have the full piece. We captured it for you.